Hi everybody, it's your human anatomy and physiology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are starting a new unit, and this is going to be a shorter unit than the last by far, but this unit is on blood. Yeah, that's right, blood. So I made the flip chart all blood colored because it's blood and blood is red and it's always red. And I'm going to talk about that later on. But this first video is going to be focused on the composition of blood, more specifically on the cells and types of plasma proteins that you're going to find in the blood. And then the second one will be on blood typing and what that's all about and why it's important. All right, everybody loves talking about blood typing. It's like everybody's favorite topic. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. But before that, we got to talk about what blood is and what it's made of. So blood, believe it or not, is a type of connective tissue. I know we didn't get as much into tissues as in past years that we did this year, but blood is a connective tissue. You wouldn't normally think of it that way, but it does connect one tissue to the next. In fact, its whole job is to carry substances from body cells, between body cells in the external environment, taking it from one tissue to the next, or from the outside to one tissue to another tissue to another tissue to another tissue. So it has a really, really important job of, in fact, connecting all of our different tissues to the external environment. Blood makes up about 8% of your body weight, and the average human being has over 5 liters of blood, and blood is heavier and much more viscous than water because it's got all these dissolved proteins, and it's packed with cells as well, so it makes sense that it's much heavier and more viscous than water. Blood is thicker than water, right? That's what you hear in like gangster movies like The Godfather and stuff. But anyway, yeah, blood's main job is to carry substances between body cells and the external environment. You breathe in oxygen. That oxygen needs to be taken everywhere throughout your entire body so that your cells can make ATP. The carbon dioxide that's a byproduct of cellular respiration needs to be taken back out. Blood's job is to carry all that and serve as the medium through which all these different molecules are transported throughout the body. Okay, you need glucose, you need amino acids, nucleotides, lipids, all that stuff is carried by blood. So let's talk about what blood's made of. So if you go to the Red Cross or whatever, you go to a blood drive here at school, what you're going to donate is whole blood, which means that you're going to be not only donating your plasma, which I'll talk about in a second, but you're also going to be donating all of your red blood cells or your erythrocytes as well, and some of your leukocytes and thrombocytes as well. But whole blood contains about 45% red blood cells and 1% of a buffy coat made of white blood cells and platelets, which we'll talk about later on, leukocytes and thrombocytes. The other 55% that isn't made up of cells themselves is plasma, and you may have heard of donating plasma before. And plasma is a watery mixture, it's a yellowish mixture that carries a wide variety of biomolecules, and we're going to be talking about what plasma carries later on, but it is the liquid in which all of these different types of cells are suspended. Okay, so it's the fluid part of the blood. It's what makes blood liquid, is the plasma. And you can donate plasma because of the stuff that it can carry, and plasma is actually very useful in pharmaceutical companies developing medicines. So that's why you can get paid for it if you donate plasma. I had some, down on their luck friends in college donate plasma a lot so that they could pay their bills and stuff. But yeah, it's something you can do. But the volume of cells in the blood is called hematocrit, and hematocrit should be anywhere from like 40 to 50% so that means just the average is 45%, but it can range, so that's what you call a hematocrit. So let's talk about red blood cells. Red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes, and they are the cells responsible for transporting oxygen through the blood. They are doing the main thing that the cardiovascular system is responsible for, carrying oxygen. You need oxygen for cellular respiration in ATP. So that's what these guys are doing. And how they're shaped, they're biconcave discs. It's a fancy word for basically like it's a donut without the hole in the middle. All right, so take a look. Here's a biconcave disc. It's got 2 concave surfaces, hence the word biconcave. And the reason why it's shaped like that is so that it increases the surface area of the cell, and the hemoglobin that those cells contain can pick up more oxygen from the lungs, right, or the alveolar surfaces that you find in the lungs. And here's the other thing. These guys are so efficient at carrying oxygen that they don't even have a nucleus. So, in fact, these mature red blood cells, they lose their nucleus in development, and they don't. That means they don't even have their own DNA. They had a nucleus once and they had DNA once, but they don't have it anymore. They're basically just bags of this protein called hemoglobin, which is a red, and it's always red. Blood is always red. I want to dispel the myth that blood is blue at any point when it travels through your body. It is not ever blue. Your veins are blue. Your vascular system is blue. Sometimes just because of the connective tissue that holds it together, but it's never blue. It's always red. And it's a red protein responsible for carrying oxygen, and it actually makes up 1/3 of the volume of each red blood cell. So really, a red blood cell is just a membrane with a bunch of hemoglobin in it. That's its thing. Iron, which is it's a metal. It's a very important element, and it's required for hemoglobin synthesis. In fact, hemoglobin is the protein at the very, very center is an iron atom that kind of holds it together. It's called a heme group. That holds that hemoglobin together. And its job is to carry oxygen. It is the oxygen-carrying molecule. Very, very important. And again, it's red. It's what makes your blood red. A deficiency of RBCs, red blood cells, or hemoglobin is what we call anemia. So there's lots of different types of anemia. You could have thalassemia. You could have sickle cell anemia. You could have iron deficiency anemia. All sorts of different types of anemia. But if you're deficient in either the red blood cells or the hemoglobin that is in those red blood cells, that's called anemia. All right, let's get into our other types of cells. Leukocytes, a white blood cell. These are your warriors of the body, of the blood. They protect against disease, and there's 5 different types of them. They're listed out here. I'm not going to have you memorize them, but we can put them into 2 groups called granulocytes and agranulocytes. But we're not going to get into too much detail about them. Basophils, eosinophils, neutrophils, monocytes, and lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are actually the cells that produce antibodies, which we'll talk about later on. But leukocytes generally cause allergic responses, so they will release things like histamine, and they'll swallow, I put in quotes, swallow harmful substances or cells through a process called phagocytosis. It'll kind of just extend its membrane around it and then bring it in and just dissolve it. So if it's like some kind of virus or bacterial cell or even like a parasite or something like that, your blood cells, your white blood cells should take care of those. And here's the other thing about leukocytes. They develop from the same process as red blood cells. So the hematopoiesis, the process by, here, let me put that in there, hematopoiesis. This is the development of blood cells. Okay, it produces leukocytes, white blood cells, and red blood cells. And those are all produced in the hematopoiesis in the red bone marrow. Yeah, so your red bone marrow produces your blood cells. All right, that's called hematopoiesis. And that includes red blood cells and white blood cells. And thrombocytes, also known as platelets. And these are cell fragments. We can't even call them real cells because, A, they don't have a nucleus, and they're way smaller than even red blood cells, and red blood cells are tiny. So like I was saying, these thrombocytes are very small cells. They're small cell fragments. They don't even count as real cells. So, sorry. But yeah, what their job is, though, is they stop bleeding. Their job is hemostasis. They really stick to the broken surfaces of blood vessels because that's what bleeding is. You know, you have a tear in a blood vessel, and then blood comes out, and that can lower blood pressure. So that's what their job is. They stick to those broken surfaces of those blood vessels, and they reduce blood flow. Should say reduce blood flow. So yeah, they stop bleeding through a positive feedback loop, which we discussed earlier in the year. Platelets stick together, and they bond together, and then they stick to the torn blood cell wall, and then they release proteins called thrombins, and those thrombins cause more platelets to aggregate in the area, stick together, and release more thrombins until a seal is formed, and you're no longer bleeding. So that's what platelets do. All right, now we're going to wrap this up by talking about plasma proteins. All blood cells are suspended in plasma, as I spoke about before. And we got 3 main types, and we're going to talk about one more in the next video called antibodies. But we got 3 main types of plasma proteins that we're going to talk about. And their job is to really regulate blood composition. So we have albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen. And we're going to get into each one of those. So albumins is the main group of plasma proteins. In fact, 66% of plasma proteins are all albumins. And their job, they're synthesized in the liver, and their job is to regulate water movement between the blood and tissues. So they have a very important job. They have to regulate osmosis in between tissues and the bloodstream. And there's actually a lot of water in your blood, and their job is to make sure not too much of it or not too little of it goes into surrounding tissues. And when you don't have enough albumins, you're going to see this in like old people whose livers aren't working as well as they should anymore. You're going to get something called edema, which is swelling of tissues with water due to low albumin concentration, right? So in old people, especially in their legs, what's going to happen is that they don't have as much albumin anymore, so they don't control as much how much water goes into their surrounding tissues. So what you'll see is swelling in these lower extremities, and then if you press it with your finger, it's going to leave a pit. And that's how you know somebody has edema and they have liver problems because they're not producing enough albumins. All right, the other two that I'm going to briefly talk about are globulins. Globulins transport lipids and fat-soluble vitamins. Think about it. Water is the main component of blood. It's mostly water. Plasma is mostly water. And some substances can't dissolve in water. They're non-polar. So globulins are special proteins that are designed to transport lipids, which can't dissolve in water, and also fat-soluble vitamins, which means they're not water-soluble. So that's another important job. And our last plasma protein that I'll talk about is fibrinogen, and that functions in blood coagulation. And we're going to talk about blood clotting here in a little bit. It can be a really good thing for when you're trying not to bleed, but it can be a really, really bad thing when, say, there's a clot that forms in a vessel that goes to your heart, or a vessel that goes to your lungs, or a vessel that goes to your brain. All really, really bad things. So we're going to talk about that later on in class, like what are the good and bad sides of having blood clots. All right. Last thing here is that plasma also carries all sorts of different gases and nutrients that are essential for cell functioning. So it carries CO2. It needs to be brought back out, right? It carries glucose, the main form of fuel that your mitochondria need. It carries amino acids, building blocks of proteins. It carries nucleotides, the building blocks of nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. It contains all types of lipids, and it contains electrolytes as well in the form of ions, positive and negative ions. When we discuss the urinary system, hopefully this year, we'll discuss what electrolytes are and how those are maintained by the action of the kidneys. So how much electrolytes and how much water is actually in your blood is maintained by the urinary system. All right, and that will be it. We'll talk about blood typing in our next video. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time. Bye.